Hey everybody, it is Ayla and this is Wife with a Purpose. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to my live stream for today. It is August 7th, Tuesday, and we are speaking today with a special guest, Luis Miguel, and he's going to be telling us giving us some insight into the Statue of Liberty, globalism, Satanism. This is going to be a fascinating conversation, and I hope you are able to stick around for it today. Please remember that we've got the super chat open. If you feel so inclined and you would like to send a super chat, it is always very welcome. Of course, also, if you'd like to support my channel, my work, my website, you can go to paypal.me/wifewithapurpose, make an easy, quick donation there. It is always much appreciated, as it does take quite a lot of time, effort, and money to keep this ministry rolling. So without further ado, I would like to go ahead and welcome our guest today. And just to give you a bit of background from my perspective, him and I met online, and we got to chatting a bit about some patriotism in America and subject matters like this. And he just kind of laid a couple of ideas on me that just blew my mind. And I said, whoa, like stop right there. I got to get you on my channel. We've got to talk about this. This is something that everybody needs to hear and think about and pray about and discern for themselves, obviously, but definitely we need to get this information out there. So Luis, welcome to the channel. Thank you so much for being here today. Please let my audience know, who you are, what's your background, and what are you about?
Oh, thanks, Ayla. I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, a bit about me. Currently, I work in the world of politics at a political consulting firm. We specialize in advertising for Republican candidates. I started with them this year. Previous to that, I was in journalism, and I worked for a few different publications, most prominently BizPac Review out of West Palm Beach. And I live now in North Florida. And in addition to what I'm doing in my day job, I run a few social media accounts and organize people in the area to fight for causes and support largely President Trump and his agenda, nationalism, and faith, Christianity. I'm a father of 3 great kids, married, and a proud Christian.
Awesome. That is excellent. I actually didn't know that you're a father. That's so great.
Oh,
how you don't have to give us specifics, but like how old is your oldest?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't mind. Oh, we have a 10-year-old girl, 4-year-old girl that just turned 4 actually a couple weeks ago, and we have a baby boy who's 9 months now.
Oh, excellent. I actually have a 4-year-old who just turned 4. She turned 4 on the 22nd of July.
22nd of July? Okay, yeah. Ours 19th of July. So.
Oh, okay, excellent. That's so awesome. Okay, so let's dive into this topic here. So Revelations 17 in the Bible, and Revelations, for those who may be unfamiliar, I mean, most people are familiar with a lot of the stuff that's in Revelations. It is an impactful chapter of the Bible. It is really kind of like probably one of the most impactful. This is the one that lays it all out for you. Kind of, you reach the end of the Bible, and then it's like, boom, here is like a huge truth bomb. So Revelation 17, walk us through this and tell us what you were thinking, how this relates to first the Statue of Liberty and then other agendas that we see politically and socially today.
Sure. Let me pull out my spectacles, get a good look at the scripture here. Now, what's amazing is that it's so often, throughout the scriptures, a lot of times things come to pass and are fulfilled. Sometimes people are aware that they're intentionally bringing to pass the scripture. Other times they're inadvertently serving as the fulfillment of the Holy Word. But in any case, what we're seeing here in Revelation 17, verse 1, I'll read that. There came one of the 7 angels, which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying, Come hither, and I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon the many waters. Further down, it has further description of this image here. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. So there are a few elements there that as I was pondering on the scripture, it brought to mind Statue of Liberty. And it might seem pretty fantastic, I know, when you start to think, because the Statue of Liberty is such an iconic part of our national patriotic culture. But when you also start to think about it, you realize how much the Statue of Liberty has also become, in essence, the great symbol of globalism in our age. And how the Statue of Liberty, as an image and what it supposedly represents. Because initially, people saw it as a representation of liberty. In fact, it was made as an embodiment of the Roman goddess Libertas, who was the goddess of liberty, but now has become more of a representation, at least modernized, of immigration. And whenever we have now debates over immigration, you have people bring to mind the M. Lazarus poem to justify unlimited immigration into our country. But but thinking about the Statue of Liberty, this came to mind as I read these scriptures. Not only because of the aspect of this symbol from this revelation of a horse sitting upon many waters, as the Statue of Liberty does, but also in verse 5, when it says, "Mystery Babylon the Great," and the reference to Babylon, which is often used throughout Scripture as a symbol of everything worldly and all sin. But it goes beyond that, because when you think about Babylon, in reality, it's also the great symbol of globalism.
Yes, definitely. So as you're speaking here, I'm thinking of this symbol. Okay, so it started out the Statue of Liberty, the goddess that's associated with liberty, and then now it's turned into this image for immigration. So do you think that perhaps it was in almost like the way Satanists will invert a cross? They'll take a symbol that's good and make it something evil. Do you think that the Statue of Liberty started out as something positive and then has been inverted in a way by like Satanists or those with a demonic agenda? Or do you think that it has always been something that had this like low level, globalist, Satanist, Babylonian agenda?
Yeah, it's something that I've been thinking myself, and I can't say with certainty myself just yet. And if you look at the background of Bartholdi, who designed Statue of Liberty, he was certainly a liberal and leftist in his day. I don't know whether he had those globalist connections per se. He was very much opposed to what was going on in his country at the time, opposed to the reign of Napoleon III. And Napoleon III, while he did set up another empire in his country, eliminate the Republic, he was power hungry, but at the same time, he wasn't a socialist. There were a lot of forces fighting in France at the time. Among them were the hard socialists and leftists. There were the more moderate liberals, and then there were the conservatives. Napoleon III was kind of a populist figure initially in terms of offering people universal suffrage. But he was also a conservative figure in the sense that he was very much devoted to the principles of property rights, religion, and the family, which the leftists, the socialists, were opposed to. And which was much to the chagrin of the more leftist factions in France. So Bartholdi, the designer of the Statue of Liberty, he was not a fan of Napoleon III, and a lot of his design of Statue of Liberty was kind of for him a form of rebellion, a manifestation of his distaste with what was going on in France at the time. So, and he was certainly a liberal. He was a leftist. I can't say with certainty right now if he was a Satanist, but it very much, like you said, a lot of times things may begin with a benevolent intention, but are sort of hijacked in essence for the purposes of globalism and of evil in the world.
Yeah, definitely. So I was looking into a little bit of the history of the Statue of Liberty, and I guess it dates back to 1886, which I think a lot of people may be surprised about because it is such an iconic symbol of our nation at this point that I think a lot of people think it's been there since 1776 or maybe even before. But it really is, relatively speaking, fairly new. And of course, isn't really based on anything that we would associate with, like, George Washington and the American Revolution. It really doesn't have much to do with that at all. And what I think is also very interesting is it was, as you were saying, it was designed by this man who was at least, at best, a leftist, at worst, maybe something else. But also that it was designed in a time and an era in France, I think that a lot of people don't realize, was after the de-Christianization of France. And a lot of people don't realize, I think, when we're taught history, we're taught about the French Revolution and how this was a wonderful thing that happened in the late 1700s, and how it somewhat coincided with our own American Revolution, and how there was kind of this spirit of liberty and the people taking power away from the monarchs and doing things for themselves and so forth. And in America, it was a little bit more benign, I think, in that, we weren't, chopping people's heads off the way they were in France. But it's always the storming of the Bastille is seen as a very symbolic gesture over in France, that it was this wonderful thing. It was this wonderful thing that they got rid of the monarchy. But then that's how it's taught. But we're not taught that they also, at the same time, when they got rid of the monarchy in France, the revolutionaries set about to very specifically de-Christianize France, and went through the Catholic Church at the time, which was probably France at that time was probably one of the strongest Catholic nations, if not the strongest Catholic nation in Europe. It even had enduring terms within the Catholic Church, being, like the sister and the daughter of the church, and things like this, because it was such a strong Catholic nation. And they went through and they just systematically destroyed the church, the same way that we see in communism and communist revolutions, is, where, we're kind of, a lot of us who are becoming red-pilled on a lot of these issues have seen images of communists dragging nuns out and shooting them, or even desecrating their bodies. This was very much also happening in the French Revolution. They were guillotining not just monarchs, but also priests and nuns by the hundreds. And France has never quite recovered from that. And so we see that happening in the late 1700s. And so by the late 1800s, when we get the Statue of Liberty coming to America from France, this is in a nation where they've had at least 3 generations post de-Christianization of that region. And I think that that's an important context in which to think about the Statue of Liberty and the possible symbolism behind it and meaning behind it. At least I think so. Would you agree?
No, I agree. And I think you can count on the fact that if you learn something, a certain perspective from your history class, at least in public schools, then it was wrong. Everything you know about the subject is wrong, including the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, just like you said, was the perfect political manifestation of the Enlightenment, and everything that came out of the Enlightenment, the philosophies. And just the Enlightenment, like the French Revolution, which came out of it, is oftentimes schools as being this great awakening of human knowledge and wisdom and understanding, when really it's the exact opposite. Really what it was, in essence, was an assault on Christianity and a movement to remove the influence of Christianity out of Western civilization. And you can see that perfectly in what actually took place in the revolution, which was the widespread murder of the clergy in France. And all of this, it ties back around to globalism and the different groups who are associated with globalism. Bringing up, for instance, the Illuminati and the historical Bavarian Illuminati, who are reported to have had a role in fomenting the French Revolution. They based, we talk about these secret societies. What they actually wanted was to create a Europe that was free of property rights, the family, and more than anything, above all else, Christianity. They wanted to remove what they considered to be the superstitious influence of religion in Europe. And so the Bavarian Illuminati, they also wanted to erode the European nations, a one-world government like we see globalists want to create now. And so here, there are the ties. The French Revolution, globalism, these secret societies, they're all one great spiderweb of cabal tied together. trying to do an assault on Christianity, which is what they hate above all else. And also, what I mentioned a little bit earlier, how we see this all the way from the beginning in the scriptures. I mean, if we look even in Genesis in the Bible, it's fascinating because we can see the roots of globalism taking place even in the beginning of the world. And we look in Genesis 11, when we have the Tower of Babel. And Babel, of course, is Babylon. Translate differently, different parts of the scriptures, but they're the same city. So Babel and Babylon. And we saw the woman, the whore that sits upon the many waters in Revelation 6:17, having Babylon written upon her crown. And at the Tower of Babel, what did that represent? Well, it was humanity trying to unite under single world government, a single language. And ultimately what they wanted was to try to achieve, in building their tower to get to heaven, achieve salvation without God, salvation without Jesus Christ and his atonement. And moreover, when we read in the scripture in Genesis 11, it says that God descended and he saw the Tower of Babel. And he said that the people, because they were all gathered together, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. In other words, they were seeking to cast off from themselves the restraints, or at least the perceived restraints, of God's commandments and God's law, to live according to the dictates of their own imagination, anything that they want to do. And that was part of the rebellion. It was in the Tower of Babel. And we can see the same things in the globalism of today, trying to erode the nations the way God made, because God was ultimately the one who instituted nations and tribes and peoples by dividing people by their tongues and families at the Tower of Babel, scattering them. So trying to undo what God himself did in uniting everyone under a single world government, a single language, and eliminate rebelling against God, his morality, and trying to live freely according to one's own personal morality.
Definitely. And you know what? You're talking about the Tower of Babel. That has always really spoken to me. And when I was learning about globalism and like you were saying, its connection to Babylon and the Tower of Babel and these anti-Christian forces, one of the things that really stood out for me with the Tower of Babel was the languages and the idea of language. And because I have a background in language, when I first went to, when I was a little girl, I've always loved languages, but I went to a special school in high school for studying foreign languages. It was a special program. Then I went on to college to continue that and to study linguistics, and I studied several different European languages, and that was kind of my foundation in a lot of my background. And so this really intrigued me because I had always seen for myself how language was such an essential part of culture. And that within family groups and within societies, how language really united a people in a specific area, in a specific nation, and how when we have immigrants that come over, a really quick check to see if they're sincere about their desire to become American is, do they learn English? And having grown up in the Southwest myself, where I saw massive immigration from Latino countries, Mexico and South America and Central America, it was really easy to pick out amongst my friends, my peers, social groups, who was really honestly wanting to be American and kind of assimilate to our values and promote our founding values. And those were the people who really made an effort to learn English and to become part of our family, so to speak. And then I saw those who had no intention of doing that were very much, opposed to anything in English. And there is obviously there was the occasional abuela who, just was too old to learn a new language, and that was a different thing. And she just, was stubborn that way. But for the most part, especially people my age and who had been brought over by their parents or so forth, I really saw that language as being such an important distinction. And then it also makes me think about, this is going to sound funny, but whales, and how whale families and whale herds have their own song, right? So they know how to identify each other in the vast stretches of the ocean. And I think that there's so much to be learned from. I think that, nature very much, the way God set things up, we can learn so much about his plan for us through the reflection of him in what he created. And as far as whale families and communities go, and they each have their own song and their own distinct language, so to speak. And so that's always been very interesting to me, because one of the first things I saw growing up in the 80s and 90s of people, the left, really trying to open our borders and just have mass immigration without assimilation, one of the first things they would say was, oh, well, it's fine for people to come over here and not speak English. It's fine. If you're one of those people that says, oh, I want English to be the official language of America, then, well, you were like this horrible racist bigot and all of, yada, yada, yada. So I think it's so interesting, the whole concept of language and family and nation and the relationship there, and what scripture tells us with the Tower of Babel and that whole story. I mean, do you see the connection there, or am I just kind of going off into the weeds?
No, absolutely. It's kind of funny. You made me think of just the other day at church. There's this sister at a church, and we moved now, but we went to visit my folks, and we interacted a little bit with her while we were over there. And so anyway, so I forget where she's from exactly, South America, somewhere over there. And then she talked with my daughter, the 4-year-old. I wasn't there at the time. My wife told me what happened. And she said that she had chastised my wife because she spoke to my daughter in Spanish, and my daughter started speaking in English. And she was saying, oh, no, you have to teach your daughter to speak in Spanish. You shouldn't be teaching her to talk in English. And you see, that's exactly the mentality they were talking about. There's ultimately, and that people bring with them, sadly, because of the encouragement from people here who aren't demanding that people assimilate. And that's what causes all this political instability that we have. Multiculturalism doesn't work. It's been a failure in our country, because you're always going to have people competing, the different groups. It's interesting because you look back, and there's immigration in our country from the beginning, not to the same levels that we have now. But there are many times when the government took specific measures with the intention of forcing people to assimilate. Just the other day, I was reading about German immigration in the 20th century and how local governments took very strong measures to crack down on people speaking German and other aspects of their original culture in order to force their assimilation. And the government was right in doing so. Nowadays, that kind of measure would be labeled racist and all kinds of other forms of bigotry. But how else are you going to create a long-term stability in our country? Mm-hmm. And right now, we're seeing the negative consequences of not doing so, sadly.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting to me, and this was like a light bulb moment for me, I have a friend who works in the public school system where she lives, and she was seeing, actually where she lived, it's very diverse. They have a lot of immigration from a lot of different areas. And what she noticed was that the school system would bend over backwards for children who immigrated from non-white countries. So if they came from the Philippines, if they came from Mexico, anything like this, they would bend over backwards to, they would hire private translators and, this and that. And, any mention of these children being taught English was almost like, reprehensible, like you couldn't even bring it up. But then in her community in particular, they also had quite a lot of Slavic immigration from Eastern European countries. Those kids were given no help at all. Absolutely none. They were not given translators. They were not given anything. They were expected to assimilate, learn English because they were white. And I just thought that was really interesting, that I guess the obviousness there of their motives, in two ways. Like, number one, white kids don't matter, no matter where they're from. They're lowest on the totem pole right now because of political correctness. And, whether or not they're struggling in school, it doesn't matter. Or struggling to learn language, it doesn't matter. And then number two, kind of this elevation and almost like fetishization of any non-white culture within America, to the point where it's like, just throw millions and millions of dollars at at it and just like and foment this division, like you're saying, because of course, if the Filipino kids, if the Latino kids, etc., aren't learning English, then they're going to create their own clusters, their own communities. It's going to be even stronger, and then they're not going to assimilate politically, socially, religiously, any of the other qualities that come along with that. And that's a huge hindrance. But of course, I think that the powers that be in our government system know that and want that. They want that multiculturalism. They want that division, that breaking apart. Because as I'm getting back to what you were saying before about these cabals, you know, family, property, religion, they want to break all of these things apart, and bringing in these different cultures that don't assimilate, these wildly different cultures, wildly different religions, especially like we've seen recently with the Muslim immigration. You know, because even, you know, to a point, Latino immigration is a little bit more assimilatable. There's a European history there. There's a Christianity there. There's some assimilatable factors, but like Arab Muslims, there's just almost nothing. There's not language, there's not culture, there's not ethnicity, there's not religion. And in fact, it's all counter. Like there's no way to absorb that in our communities. So we see them getting even more. It's like, okay, so, you know, opening up the southern border wasn't quite enough. Let's you know, and of course, you know, 1/4 to 1/2 of Latinos vote conservative anyway. So it's like, well, that wasn't enough. So let's bring in Muslims. That'll be a harder blow, particularly African Muslims, Somalis, and things like this.
Right.
So yeah, I think that it's really interesting how that all plays out. So you were telling me before we got started here that you see globalism very much as satanic. Do you want to kind of walk us through that a little bit and give us a little bit of how you came to that belief and where you find supporting evidence for that?
Sure. And touching on what you were saying right now, you know, all this political instability, and you know, the question is multiculturalism, is all of these things, are they failing? Failing, yes, as far as creating a thriving society, but succeeding as far as the goals of the globalist cabal is backing it, because that's precisely what they want, is to erode our society, our culture. And above all, what the globalists hate more than anything is Christianity. And that alone is a form of evidence or support to the ties between Satanism and globalism. Because when you stop to think about it, and I know there are a lot of people, nationalists, people on our side on the right, who are atheists or belong to other faiths. They aren't necessarily all Christian. But I think it's still important that everybody recognize the immense relationship between Western civilization and Christianity. Because Western civilization essentially is Christendom. Throughout history, you didn't have the European nations or Western civilization without Christianity. They were inextricably tied together. The globalists understand that, which is why, from a political perspective, they do everything they can to destroy Christianity, its influence over society. But it goes even beyond the political. I believe that they truly hate Christianity and everything it represents, because their souls have already been sold to the adversary, to Satan. And again, just to repeat, they hate Christianity more than anything else. Just look at the fact that they support Islam and will support everything that it stands for on a political basis, even though some of the things that are part of Islamic culture are contrary to the degenerate morality they claim to support. You know, as far as things like views on homosexuality or the roles between men and women, they are in Islamic, or at least many Islamic cultures, the people who are immigrating from there, you could say more fundamental or traditional, and with things that leftists and globalists are supposedly against. But they don't care, because what they really care about is destroying Christianity and erasing it from the public sphere. And so you go back all the way, again, bringing up Genesis and the Tower of Babel. You could say that was the first recorded instance of globalism that we have right there in Scripture. And then you look at what globalism is trying to achieve. And its complete adversarial relationship with Christianity. And then you have these secret cabals that we've been talking about, and their aims and their practices. We talked a little bit about the Illuminati earlier, and how their state aim was the elimination of the influence of religion. And we also have the Bavarian Grove, and out in California. Have you talked about that one on your show at all?
I have never talked about that one. And it's funny, it's an interesting history because I have a lot of friends who are really into studying the Illuminati about, 10 years ago or something. And I kind of thought they were crazy, I'll be honest. I was like, no, and the Bohemian Grove. And I'm like, that can't be real. And then after 2 years ago with the spirit cooking and all of that during the last presidential election, when that all came out, I was like, whoa, okay, my eyes have been opened. These people really are literally satanic, and they're literally doing satanic rituals. But yes, please tell us about Bohemian Grove. Give us a background on that.
Right, and this one is, once you learn what's going on there, there's no doubt in your mind that what's underlying the foundations of globalism are in fact satanic. So yeah, so the Bohemian Grove, a compound out in California, out in the woods, a campsite where the world's most powerful men, mostly American men, politicians, businessmen, but many foreigners as well, they meet out there, supposedly to network, supposedly get to know each other. The Bohemian Club, which sponsors and owns the Bohemian Grove and runs the activities there, was originally a group of bohemians, artists and poets in the United States, but eventually turned into more of men of influence, men of power and money. And what they do out there is all kinds of crazy and fantastic things that it sounds like the kind of thing out of a novel until you discover that all of it is true and on record. Many US presidents, I think since around the 20th century, starting in the 20s or 30s, every Republican president, with the exception, interestingly enough, of Donald Trump, many Democratic presidents, have been members of the Bohemian Club and attended the events there. One of the principal aspects of the activities there are the fact that they prance around the woods in the nude and urinate freely wherever they want. And apparently, urinating wherever they want is a representation of them being free from the cares of the world. But going back to the Tower of Babel, when God said that nothing would be restrained from them that they imagine to do, what they're really doing, shedding off the restraints of morality of the Christian and God's law that he's given to us. But the most impactful thing that goes on to Bohemian Grove is what's now performed in the first weekend when they arrive there, a ceremony known as the cremation of care, in which they burn this human effigy, which they say represents a character named Care. In other words, the cares of the world, or the cares of morality. And they burn an effigy while they're dressed, all in robes. And a man, one of the individuals there reads the words of the ceremony, which you hear it sounds completely satanic. I have right here what I'm looking at is a copy of the New American, a fantastic magazine, which I recommend to everybody, published by the John Birch Society, which sadly enough is a fantastic group that was alienated by mainstream conservatives like William F. Buckley, who was a globalist himself, because they were telling the truth.
Yeah, I highly recommend the John Birch Society. That was one of my avenues to the right.
Absolutely. So everyone watching, John Birch Society, New American, a fantastic magazine. And again, everything that's here is public record. You can go and verify it yourself. Here's some of the words from the cremation of care ceremony. And they light this pyre, they burn this human effigy, and they do it. Here's the thing, they do it in front of a giant owl statue, a 40-foot concrete owl, which some people believe is representation of the biblical demon god of Moloch, to which children and infants were sacrificed. And the officiator of this ceremony says words that include the following. O owl, prince of all moral wisdom, Owl of Bohemia, we beseech thee, grant us thy counsel. Be gone, detested care, be gone. Once more we banish thee. Be gone, dull care. Fire will have its will with thee. Hail, fellowship's eternal flame. Once again, midsummer sets us free.
Mm.
And so the fascinating thing about that, and keep in mind that it's powerful men, including our presidents, who are there, running around in nude, participating in these shady rituals. But what's the emphasis there? And in all of what takes place at Bohemian Grove, it's this concept of liberation, of personal freedom, freedom from morality, freedom from any kind of restraint. It takes me back to the scripture. And I happen to be LDS Mormon. And Book of Pearl of Great Price contains writings from Moses, which we believe to be books that originally belonged to Genesis, but were lost over the years. They contain accounts, further details over events that take place in Genesis, creation of the world, Adam and Eve. And so there's one section there. It gives a greater detail into the story of Cain and Abel. And when Cain murders Abel, he makes a pact with Satan, that Satan will conceal Cain's works and his assassination of his brother in exchange for Cain serving him. And after Cain carries out this murder of the righteous man Abel, he says the words, "I am free."
Mm.
And that is the great goal always of Satanists, is this notion of freedom. But it's not true freedom like the gospel gives, but it's this desire to be free from God, to do as one pleases. And everything that Satanists seek is based around that. And it also brings us back to the idea of these secret societies. You know, Cain, he could do he was creating what we in Mormon, in the LDS Church, we Mormons often refer to as secret combinations,
Mm-hmm.
gatherings of people who commit works in the dark, who keep their dealings from the world in secret, often to do assassination and to overthrow governments. So how else can you describe what's being done by all these globalists who are meeting in secret in places like the Bohemian Grove and the Illuminati in the Skull and Bones?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
People meeting in secret, plotting the overthrow of their governments in order to institute a one world order that is godless, anti-family, and anti-personal property.
Yes, definitely. Wow. So that was a lot of information. And I think you laid it out perfectly. I'm going to pause just for a second
Sure.
to read 2 super chats, because we received 2. The first one is from John Goras. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. $5. Thank you very much, John. It says, you notice how Alex Jones was axed just a couple of days after Isaac Cappy, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, gave him an interview on Pedowood. And of course, Pedowood being a reference to the pedophilia scandals coming out of Hollywood lately. And then we can talk about that in just a sec. I'll read the second super chat. And this is from Curzon79. Thank you so much. And he says, thank you, $20 Australian. And he says, thank you for all that you do, Ayla. Keep up the good work. Thank you. I appreciate that so much. I always appreciate you guys' super chats. But getting back to this first one from John, the Alex Jones situation ties really well into this, because Alex Jones has been talking about the Bohemian Grove and the Illuminati and all of this, and he's been tying it to Christianity and to this spiritual battle that is going on for a while. And I know Alex Jones gets a lot of heat. You know, obviously there's a lot of memes about him and making the frogs gay and all of this, and people like to joke about him. And he does have a very interesting personality, obviously, that's a little unconventional, particularly for relaying news. He gets very worked up and so forth. But one of the things that happened to me again during the Trump election with the spirit cooking, and I was familiar with Jones's work, but again, it was kind of through my friends who were more into the Illuminati thing, and I kind of wasn't as into Alex Jones before. But then when the whole spirit cooking thing came to light, it was like, oh my gosh, they really are doing these satanic rituals, and we have, proof, we have emails, we have pictures. Then I actually told my husband, I don't want to live in a world where Alex Jones is right, but unfortunately, it's like he was very right, and that's something that just like mentally had to deal with for the past 2 years. But getting back to the pedowood and the Hollywood pedophilia scandal, that's been coming. So that's the next thing. I think the big thing that's been coming out, where we have very specific proofs that a lot of these guys are into pedophilia, and of course there's no real pushback from Hollywood. They're not really, getting fired or, things like this. We've had one incident where the Guardians of the Galaxy director lost his position. But other than that, I mean, there's, the creator of Rick and Morty cartoon, there's literally pictures of him out there of him doing horrible things that I won't describe, and with children or with images of children. And, he's not facing really any backlash from the leftist community. It seems to be condoned. And a lot of them are making a lot of excuses for these old, so-called pedophilia jokes and things like this that people are digging up on them. And yeah, Alex Jones was, for those who might not know, very briefly, yesterday, well, over the past 4 days, he was kind of targeted, but yesterday was really a massive takedown. He lost his YouTube, he lost his Facebook. 4 days ago, he'd lost his Spotify. Apple iTunes took him down out of their podcast. It was like this massive coordinated strike to just completely genocide him from the internet. And I think that that's incredibly telling, and think what you will about Alex Jones or him personally or his background or whatever. It's very telling that these are the things he was talking about. And then suddenly they are just basically trying to drone strike him off the internet, just bomb, like everywhere that he was, and completely obliterate him.
Absolutely. They know they were onto them, and the time is running out for them. There's been a great awakening people waking up to the truth in the last couple of years, more than I think what we've seen in previous decades. And they're scared. They're getting desperate. And what's funny is that often when people are desperate, they make mistakes. So they're striking out people like Alex Jones. But of course, by doing so, only confirming to those who are in the know that they're guilty. But of course, it does pose challenges for those of us, especially people who are trying to get the word out. They have a lot of power because they control these platforms, and they can silence people to a great degree. Fortunately, Alex, with InfoWars, their website's still going strong, so he'll still be able to get the word out there. For people who are a bit smaller scale, it's more difficult. They get deplatformed, they get taken off YouTube, Twitter, and sometimes that can be the complete end of a source of income for somebody.
Yeah, definitely. I think people kind of at my level were more hurt by that sometimes. I've even found, even at my level, it seems to, when I'm deplatformed, then there's more people, or when I'm lied about in the media, there's more people that come to my resources, and whether that in my social media, my YouTube, whatever, and actually like, oh wow, well, it wakes a lot of people up. It's really interesting because they'll say, oh well, they're saying this about her in the press, and they'll go and they'll look, and they're like, wow, that's not what she's talking about at all, and that's not what she's about at all, and what she is about is very interesting and fascinating, and it kind of starts them out on their journey, and that's been interesting to see as well. But definitely people like me, as far as financially and things like that, getting deplatformed in certain respects can really wipe us out. But in Alex Jones, I think it was really interesting because my husband had a complete different reaction. I was saying, oh my goodness, they've just taken Alex Jones off of everything, and this is massive. And he goes, this is great. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean it's great? And he's like, no, do you know how many people are like Googling Alex Jones right now who might not have heard about him before, and who are now like, oh, and they're clicking a link and another link and another link, and they're reading, and they're thinking. And even if they don't wake up and, till 5 or 10 years from now, it's planting those seeds of information and sending them to other things, like Natural News, who and the Health Ranger, who was very associated with InfoWars, and it's sending them to places like the John Birch Society and all of these other things that can help wake them up to what's going on, and how to prepare for this, and how to fight this spiritual battle that we're in. So ultimately, even though Alex himself might take a hit, a financial hit, or whatever else, and hopefully he doesn't, hopefully he's able to just keep going on alternative platforms and so forth, and that his core audience will definitely, I think, stick around and continue to support him financially. it is long term in the long game that we're playing here. It's actually a win for us. Because all it does is make them look desperate. When they silence people, even small people like me to large people like Alex Jones, it just makes them look like they are desperate and scrambling. We've got another super chat from Lacey Lynn. Thank you, Lacey. You are so sweet to give a super chat. That's so nice of you. And she says, America was blessed by God and America needs to get back to God. Our empathy, quote unquote, will be our demise. Some say America won't even be here in the end times. What does the guest think of this theory? So if you're just tuning in, my guest is Luis Miguel, and we are talking about the Statue of Liberty in relation to Revelations 17, but we're also talking about globalism and its connection to Satanism. But what do you think, Luis, about the idea that America won't be here in the end times?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you. Yeah, it is actually something that I've thought quite a bit about. And it's interesting because so many Christians, I think, sometimes take a fatalistic perspective, almost that they want, in a sense, to lose because it would be a confirmation that we're getting to the end times. And who doesn't want to be around when Jesus Christ returns to the earth? Mm-hmm. I think all of us would like to be there in person the day that he comes back. And so sometimes people, they're excited, and maybe they don't try their best to stop this takeover by the satanic elements and the satanic actors, because they want to see things get bad, perhaps not intentionally, but maybe unconsciously, so they can bring about what we know is going to happen according to the scriptures, the return of Jesus. Whether America will be here when Jesus Christ comes back, I think that's something that isn't written in stone. I think that's something that's up to us to determine whether it will be or won't be. I do believe, like you, like the guest or the viewer who wrote right now, I think that America was divinely inspired. God chose righteous men to found this country. He inspired the creation of the Constitution. As a result, I believe that he, especially because we're a republic, we're not a monarchy, where the sins of the nation can be placed upon the head of a wicked monarch. We're a republic where ultimately we will be held responsible for the fate of this country, whether it continues in righteousness or whether it falls into wickedness and demise. And so, God created this country, and it's up to us to protect and to preserve it as a righteous country and as a land of liberty. When Jesus comes, I think that it can be preserved if we have the strength and the courage to do what we need to do. If it isn't, if it fades away, well, then I think ultimately that'll also be on our heads, those of us who didn't do our part.
Definitely. I agree with that. And I think that what's interesting about the end times idea as well, for Christians, is I think definitely there's this idea that, who doesn't want to be around when Jesus comes back? But I think there's also, for me, I've witnessed kind of this additional idea of what I kind of term the apocalypse fetish. And I think that there's something in human nature that kind of, and maybe it's a longing for the end times, I'm not sure, but there's something kind of, it seems, in human nature that we want to be the last generation, that we want something to be, we don't want to be a link in a chain. We want to be the beginning or the end of something great. And we want to be this kind of this standout thing, this thing that is different from what came before. And that, that somehow when we die, the sun will not go on rising and setting, that it is the end of everything that as we know it, that the world won't go on. I think something about human nature, maybe it's a fear of death. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but there's something in there where we kind of want all things to stop, to begin and to end with us. And so it kind of, for me, I've seen in popular society, it turns into this apocalypse fetish. So whereas, any kind of apocalypse thing, whether it's like a Walking Dead, right now we're going through kind of this, the past 10 or 20 years in our society, this kind of like zombie fetish thing where, it's kind of the end of the world because, there's been some great thing, massive die-off or something like this. And now there's zombies everywhere. But before that, in the 1950s and 60s, you see in sci-fi, kind of this idea of, aliens coming down and mass exterminating almost everyone on the planet. And, there's one guy left surviving with his family, or, these sorts of ideas, and they're very appealing to something in our psyche. And so I think that it's true that sometimes we do have people, and I've even heard it explained to me, like somebody told me once, I know when to work and I know when to just put on a wig and dance because the party's over. And I think a lot of people are like just putting on their wigs and dancing and saying, oh, the party's over, so let's just watch it all go down in flames. And I think that you bring up a really important point for Christians, that we can't do that. We can't just, abdicate our responsibilities in preserving and fighting for what's right, whether that is sustaining a godly America, or if America were to fall or balkanize or whatever else, wherever we happen to be, or if we're not Americans, if we're Canadians, Europeans, or whatever, wherever we happen to be, if we're not fighting for the godly truth and the godly side of things, then we're going to be held accountable for our actions or our inactions. And I wanted to get back a little bit to what you were saying before about Bohemian Grove, because there was a couple of things that stood out to me. First of all, when you think about Bohemian Grove and these rituals and the burning of effigies and this owl that represents Moloch and things like this, and when you were saying that the chants or the scripture thing, they're weird scriptures that they read and whatever during this event, during this ritual, what came to me was the idea of fairy tales. And just as a side note, I think that the scripture is obviously the most important things that we can be reading and studying. But I think the second most important thing is European fairy tales. And when I say European, I'm talking everything from, Ireland over to Russia, and everything from, the northernmost tip of Norway down to the southernmost tip of Spain. All of those cultures, Latin cultures, Greek cultures, etc., Slavic cultures, Nordic cultures, they have amazing fairy tales. And what we have now are watered down versions. So I'm not talking about the Disney versions. I'm talking about like Grimm's fairy tales. I'm talking about Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, and even getting them in their original form, because a lot of them have been edited because they're not politically correct anymore. But reading those, because those were tales that were handed down by our ancestors, the ancestors of Western civilization, as well as anyone with ethnic European blood. It was handed down by our ancestors as a warning. A lot of these tales very much are warnings. One of the ones I like to talk about is Rumpelstiltskin, because that one is probably one of the most obvious. There's a peasant woman, she is taken by the prince, to spin straw into gold. He thinks that she can do it. She can't do it. And instead of owning up to what she can't do and taking personal responsibility, there's this little gold man comes in and says, I'll do it for you. And all you have to give me is, basically she has to give him her ring, and then the next night her necklace, but then she's out of her own personal wealth. And so for the last payment, he asks for her child. Give me your child. So we have these creatures and characters in our society who are saying, give me your children, quite literally. And the way that she was able to overpower him and get, save her child was to name him, was to figure out his name and who he was, right? And so that's just an easy one, but there's so much richness in those tales. And if you're familiar with those and you're familiar with scriptures, when you hear of something like Bohemian Grove, I think it's an instant click of like, yes, we've been warned about this. We've been warned about this not only by God, but also by our ancestors. And one other thing was the animalistic nature of it, the free peeing and the nudity really stood out to me, because I think that is the one thing, civilization, especially Western civilization, is such a gift from God, and it separates us from animals. And one of the common themes to all of these globalist ideas is returning us to our animal nature, returning us to this like wild nature where we're peeing, in the woods and running around naked and things like this. And it reminds me of the policies they're putting in place in Western countries where they're allowing immigrants to openly defecate on the streets because, well, this is part of their culture, this is part of their culture and things like this. And having been back in my hippie and liberal days, I went to a lot of, festivals and things like that. And that's one of the things that they do. So there's two main things that these people seem to use. And that's public urination and defecation, which is just horrible. And then, sex everywhere. Everyone should be having sex with everybody. So these are two very animal-like qualities that they want human beings to take on, to take us into this like hedonistic, animalistic state, which separates us from our godly and more spiritual state and makes us more susceptible to the Satanists, to these globalists, to the Illuminati, to Babylon. Do you see that connection there?
Oh, absolutely. And I would actually like to take that and tie it back to what you were talking about a minute ago with fairy tales and Rumpelstiltskin in particular. That just occurred to me right now very powerfully as you were relating that fairy tale and how she was able to save her son in that story by knowing the name of the little figure, Rumpelstiltskin. And I think that's a powerful lesson for us right now who, whatever you want to call yourself, right-wing, nationalist, a supporter of Western civilization, Christian, those of us who are on this team, I think that's why it's so important to understand this spiritual aspect of the fight, which is really the fundamental aspect of it. And we talk a lot about immigration and related topics, globalization, global economy. These are all things that tie together with this movement, this fight that we're engaged in. But it's important not to lose sight of the spiritual component, which is really the most basic component, what really all comes down to. Because immigration, I often say, is the chief weapon being used by the globalists. But the globalists themselves are Satanists. So it's important to deal with their weapon, but also know who the enemy is exactly. You can't win if you don't know your enemy, if you can't name your enemy. It's like if your neighbor sets his dog on you to attack you. In this case, mass migration is like the neighbor's dog being sent to attack you. You deal with it with the immediate threat to your life. But then after you deal with the threat, if you don't deal with the evil neighbor himself who's trying to kill you, you'll just be susceptible to future attacks. So the immigration is extremely important because, again, it's the chief weapon being used to erode Western civilization, America specifically. It's also important to be able to name and to identify who the true adversary actually is. And in this case, it's these globalistic cabals. And who are they? At the end of the day, they're Satanists. And I also was fascinating the topic about fairy tales, because you see how they become corrupted in modern day. One important difference I see between the true fairy tales, they're passed down from generation to generation, and they were the stuff of learning for young people for thousands of years, is that in the original fairy tales, the emphasis was always on the young people or kids learning wisdom from the older generation and seeing the error of their ways and becoming wise by listening to the counsel and the warnings from their elders. And nowadays, if you look at the quote-unquote new myths of popular culture, whereas represented by Disney and other companies, you notice that the emphasis is always on that the older generation doesn't know what they're talking about, and that the young people and the kids have to stop listening to their outdated, ignorant elders and just follow their hearts and doing whatever they want.
Yeah, 100%. I think a lot of the memes that go around now with you just do you, I'll do me and you do you. And like those kind of things, follow your heart, follow your dreams, this overly romanticized notions in our culture definitely it is attacking that. And I think that you bring out such an important part, that the wisdom of the elders was something that was taught in our culture. It's something that's still very much taught in Asian culture, which I think is very admirable, although they're being influenced quite a lot by degeneracy as of late. But up until very recently, and still true today, they're taught to respect their elders, to gain wisdom from their elders. And in fact, in their religious traditions, it's very much about almost a deification or worship of their ancestry. I think this is something that Mormonism gets very right, in that it emphasizes family history. And so when you are researching these people and you're reading about their struggles, whether they were Mormon pioneers or whether you're a convert to the church and you just, researching other non-Mormon ancestors, all of our ancestors struggled, and they struggled a great deal to get us to where we are. And when you have an appreciation for that, when you've really read about these stories about what they did and how they lost children and how they struggled just to survive and to get another mouthful of food into the next generation, it really gives you a sense of respect for your elders. And this is something that obviously, getting back to the attack on family, which is really an attack on Christianity, is something that has been under attack in earnest, obviously, since the 1960s. When, the me generation, the boomers, decided that they were more wise than their predecessors, and that they could come up with these new strategies for living in the world, dealing with the world, relating to the world, etc. And I think that it's really important. I like how you say we have to talk about the spiritual component, because this is something I've tried to emphasize for the past couple of years in my work. There's a lot of different weapons that they're using. I started out my work talking about feminism, which I think is probably their most powerful weapon, one of their most powerful weapons right now. But again, they're using it to attack Christianity. And there's of course, the attack on ethnically white people, the for lack of a better term, the racism against them. We see in Sarah Zhang of the New York Times. Obviously that's a popular story right now, where, she's written all of these, anti-white, very hateful tweets. And of course, Twitter doesn't take them down. She doesn't get fired from her job, nothing. But then, Candace Owens, a conservative Black woman, did a little, experiment there, which anybody can do. And a lot of people have done in the past, where, she just took those tweets word for word and replaced white with Jewish, and her account was immediately suspended. So we see that there's an attack on, white identity. We see there's an attack on Western identity in general. One of the things I've spoken to in my work in the past couple of years is, it's not just white people. When, if they get rid of white people and white civilization, well, then they're just going to come for Asians. They're going to come for mixed race people. They're going to come for conservative Latinos. They're just going to, it doesn't stop. It's not going to stop. If you get rid of all whites, it's not going to cure anything. These same elements are just going to keep coming for whoever's the next most conservative, most closely related to Christianity that they can find. And there was a headline recently that said, "Are conservative Christian Black men the white men of the Black community?" Right? And so it's like, they're just going to keep going. So there's the race factor, but at the end, so there's feminism and there's race, and there's the attack on the Western civilization in general. There's immigration that they're using. There's the hedonistic things, the free urination and the defecation, and they're using Islam against us and all of these things. But when it gets back to it, these, like you were saying, these are all the weapons that they're just kind of hammering us with. But at the end of the day, under all of that, it's all an attack on Christianity. All of it gets back to that essential thing. And because of that, I think it's so important that we keep peeling that back. I think it's important to talk about the weapons they're using, to talk about feminism, to talk about white identity, to talk about Western civilization and things like this. But we have to keep peeling back those layers and exposing what the root of it is. Because once we get them to stop using one weapon, they'll just switch to a different mode. We've got to get to the root, like you were saying. And we were talking about the root. That reminded me in Waldorf education, which is a European-based pedagogy for teaching children. There's this concept of the root children. So these little children that live in the roots of trees. It's a very European-minded story or fable about, you know, the seasons and the little root children coming from the roots of the trees and affecting the seasons and the changes of the earth. But again, it's one of those like the fairy tales, where it's trying to teach us something. We need to get to the root of issues because that's where everything is coming from. Everything is, we've got to take it down to the root. It's nice to see the changes of the leaves and the fall and all of this, but we need to take it down and see what is creating these changes. And so again, we can learn so much from family history, from our cultural histories, and no matter what culture you belong to or what ethnicity, you can learn a lot from that. And see how the attack on the family, the attack on the property, attack on religion, on all of these things. And I would include attack on property right now is these deplatformings, you know, taking Red Ice off from PayPal, taking Faith Goldie, you know, banning her from PayPal. And these attacks on being able to make a living is really an attack on property, on privatization of being able to earn your own bread by the sweat of your brow, as the Bible would say. And so I'm starting to babble. But we are about at an hour, 12 minutes. So I think we'll wrap up here in a minute. What other closing thoughts would you kind of take us out on, do you think?
Well, I think we've had a pretty good conversation. Disney, don't take your kids to watch Disney. You're just feeding the beast. That's a tangent that came on a few minutes ago when we were on that subject. You know, just like what happened recently with James Gunn, Guardians of the Galaxy. He had Sarah Silverman also, who appeared in that recent Disney movie. And she also has had that pedophile-themed tweet. So Disney, they know what they're doing. And they're controlled by these same satanic globalist influences, and they're another instrument that's being used to brainwash our children, erode Western civilization, erode Christianity. And just think, for instance, about that movie, Frozen, and the famous song from it, "Let It Go." Mm-hmm. Let it go. What's it all? It all comes back to the same thing. This notion, this corrupted notion of satanic freedom from the restraints of God's law, and wanting to do as one pleases.
Yeah, 100%. That's actually, it's very interesting that you bring up Frozen, because when I heard that Disney was making Frozen and that it was based on kind of like Sami culture and that sort of thing, I was really excited at first, because I've always, well, for years and years now, since I was in graduate school and I learned about Sami culture, always thought that was really, they had a fascinating culture. And so I was really excited for this movie to come out. And my family usually doesn't go to the movies hardly at all. If we do watch a movie, it's usually once it's on, you know, download on Amazon or something. So we didn't go to Frozen right away or anything like this. And then what was interesting to me in that movie was the sheer amount of obsession it created really set off alarm bells for me. And anytime any kind of movie or pop culture thing creates that much of an absolute obsession, you know, to where my friends were saying, like, my girls will not watch any other movie. It's like they have to watch this movie 3 times a day, or like, you know, I just catch heck from them about it, etc. It really set off alarm bells for me. And my girls were still fairly young, because my girls are only 6 and 4. So when Frozen came out, they were still quite young. But I just kind of decided, you know what, I don't think we're going to watch that movie. And then for a very long time, I'd even managed to never hear any of the score from the film as well, until we were at a public park event and they were playing music, and I finally heard the Let It Go song, and I went, oh my gosh. To me, it sounded very pro-gay, the way that the gay rights uses that kind of language, that, you know, again, the be you, be yourself, kind of let everything else go and really get into it. I know that there was, subsequently I found more, I think they're called Mormon Women Stand. They're conservative Mormon women's group who had also written about Frozen and about some of the imagery in the songs and the music, and how they thought it was part of the kind of a gay agenda, really. Yeah. not because of the relationship between the sisters, but because of the music and the imagery of the letting it go, being yourself kind of a thing. And so I think that that's really interesting. And I like how you said, don't feed the beast. And I definitely recommend people don't, do the Disney thing, particularly the modern Disney. But also I think be on the lookout for those cultural things, whether they're Disney or not, that create such an amount of obsession. The other one that I would caution people against is Harry Potter. And when Harry Potter first came out, I didn't think it was a very big deal. And there were a lot of Christians who were really against Harry Potter, mostly because of the, obviously the witchcraft and the wizardry. But I didn't think it was a very big deal. And in fact, after about the third movie came out, and the kids in the movie were a little bit more grown up and the movies were a little bit more interesting, I actually started to enjoy the movies myself. And so I think my oldest son was just a baby when the third movie came out. And so after that, the third one, we kind of went, we would go and see them in theaters when they came out. And then when the last book came out, my family, we read it aloud together. I only had 2 small children at the time, but we read it out loud together. And I didn't much think about it at the time as being something bad. But I did notice the obsessive quality again about it. I mean, people were literally treating this thing like it was the Bible. They would get these books and they would like highlight them and note them, and they would memorize all of these, backstories of the characters to just an obsessive degree. And I thought, well, maybe it's just like a Star Wars or something like that. People are just really getting into it. But now, as we've seen that generation of people who grew up with Harry Potter are now becoming adults, that is almost, I would say 50% of the liberals I run into will reference Harry Potter as though it's real. And they will reference it as part of their reasoning for their belief set in this like ultra social justice warrior belief set that they belong to now. And it's almost as though some of them really, honestly, truly, a great deal of them lost connection with reality through these books. And then I went back and I looked at the books a few years ago, and I looked at the story, and it's like, okay, it's a cute story. It's an interesting story, but it's not even a Star Wars level of originality or depth. And I thought, and I started to say, literally amongst my family and then also on social media, I think J.K. Rowling sold her soul to the devil. Like, I really, honestly, and it started out as half joking, and now I'm really looking at this, and I'm looking at 20 plus years of having Harry Potter in the world and going, that story is not so interesting enough that she should have become a multi-billionaire, and it created that level of obsession. Like, you can go back and find dozens of kids' books released around the same time that have way more interesting stories, that are much better written, that have much more depth to them than those stories. And so I started to think, I think she may have literally been a single mom on the dole, poor. I don't even know if it would have been like literally like where a devil would come to her and she's signing her name in the book, or whether it was more of just a spiritual relaxation in her of like giving herself over to an adversary, to the adversary, or maybe even a low-level possession of a sort. But then seeing her, J.K. Rowling's, also her rabid liberalism, and how she's now pushing this horde of this Dumbledore's army that she built through her literature, that these kids grew up on these books, and now they're just like her little army. And she sends a tweet out, and these people just believe it, and they will defend it, and they will fight for it. And it's actually really frightening when you look at it. So I caution people, when you have kids, be hyper vigilant about those things. When things reach that level of obsession, like Frozen and Harry Potter, that should set off alarm bells for people, I think. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. J.K. Rowling. I think, first of all, sometimes, and this is a lot of times how the left operates, so it's important to understand. A lot of times the media itself that they create might not be bad in and of itself. But what they do is they create something that, like with these young people who grew up reading Harry Potter, they become so emotionally attached to something that then they are willing to follow the creator of it, or the organization they put out. They're willing to follow that to whatever philosophical, moral, political point they drag out. So all these people, they become huge fans of Harry Potter. Now anything that J.K. Rowling says that's against Christianity, pro homosexuality, whatever it might be, they're with her, supporting that. Another thing, let's see, we were talking about. Okay, I forgot. But yeah, a lot of times we just have to be careful and vigilant about what we're exposing our children to. A lot of times, follow the trail, see who exactly is putting it out, what their backstory is, what their morality is, what their values are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when it comes to your kids. And I've noticed that through trial and error, raising my kids, my oldest is 15, is that they do idolize these people. And looking back on my own teenage years, where I started to really get into the left, was actually fairly more conservative conservative minded and traditional until I was about 13, 14 years old. And what ended up happening with me is I got really into the band U2. And their album Zooropa and things like this, and I'm dating myself. But anyways, I really, really loved them, and I just thought Bono was the cutest thing ever, and I just oh my goodness, he was so sexy and whatever. And I really got into them, and so I started reading little inserts that they put in their, again, I'm going to date myself, their cassette tapes. And it was for Greenpeace International and Amnesty International. They were doing little promos for those where they would write the lyrics and stuff in the cassette tape part. And I this very early days of the internet, would go on and look this up. Who's Amnesty International? They fight for human rights, so-called, and I got really into that. For better or for worse. I think there is definitely some things that Greenpeace or Amnesty International do that's good, but a lot of it was from this globalist, leftist, almost pagan, environment worshiping perspective. And it was really a huge thing that set me off on the wrong foot. And so looking at my own children, I noticed that when my son liked the Harry Potter books and he liked the movies, that the Harry Potter books were some of the first books that my oldest son read on his own. And I was just oh, he's reading, so this is good at the time. But then I noticed that he really was making idols out of J.K. Rowling and out of the actors that were in the film. And then he would want to go on their Instagram accounts. And he's still like this. If he likes a show or he likes a book, he wants to go on, Guardians of the Galaxy or anything like that. He wants to go on the actors' Instagram accounts and things like that. And most of the time, 99.9% of the time, I have to say no. I'll go and look at their accounts, or even an account, I'll go through the account and I'll think, okay, this actor, actress, or whatever isn't posting anything that looks controversial or that looks leftist or that's, immodest or something. And I'll let him follow them on Instagram for a little while. And, I'm of course always looking over his shoulder about these sorts of things. And then all of a sudden it'll come up, some huge pro-gay, blah, 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 something. And I'm oh man, it's every single time, it seems that happens. So we just have to be really vigilant. And of course the Guardians of the Galaxy actors, came out basically defending that director. Most of them did, and so forth. And so we have to be really careful. And we've got one more super chat, and then I think we'll close up. So this is from producer Chris, $10. Thank you so much. Ayla, to confirm your suspicions, I knew a straight A+ student in high school named April. She was very, very obsessed with Harry Potter. Since then, she has had a sex change operation. Oh my goodness. Yeah, and I think that, again, when we see this blurring of gender, transgender, gender fluid, non-binary, blah, 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 it does come a lot from this idea that you can be whatever you want through magic and mysticism and sorcery and a lot of these things, and to do what you want, you be you, and you do you, and all of these catchphrases we hear. And I think what's very, also getting back to the Harry Potter just for a second, is that J.K. Rowling has also, she wrote those books, starting out, 20 years ago or something. So they're a little dated at this point, social justice warrior wise. And she's actually gone back and put things in, towards the end of the series, she made Dumbledore gay. Oh, yeah. And now she's gone back and said, well, Hermione wasn't necessarily white. Did anything. So, it goes to be this transracial. And then I'm sure it's going to be coming that like Harry Potter doesn't even have to be a man or a woman. He could have been a gender fluid, it's going to come. Mark my words. She's going to tweet about it at some point. But so, yeah, so they're even going back and placing this like post writing onto these things and just really manipulating our children, and now manipulating a whole generation of young adults with this. And Curzon79 in the chat recommends Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And definitely, if your kids are into kind of the sci-fi fantasy genre, you want to definitely be getting them into that. There's also some really great LDS Mormon authors to look into, like Brandon Mull, and who writes Fablehaven, Candy Shop Wars, series like that. There are some, if your kids like magic and they like that kind of thing, there are ones that are written from Christian perspectives that you can get them that are going to be a lot better than the Harry Potter garbage. So somebody said, John Goris in the chat says the 90s Potter isn't woke enough, apparently. Yeah. Yeah, she's gotta reawaken it. But oh my goodness, you know what? I have a ton of notes here and I could just like continue talking forever, but we're at an hour and a half now. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap up.
Before we end, I do have a couple more things.
Yes, please.
Just really briefly, I promise. First of all, small plug here. Yeah, if you really like fantasy fiction, Castelli House, publishing house, has a lot of great fiction.
Oh, yeah.
Vox Day. I just finished reading recently a couple of his books, Throne of Bones and A Sea of Skulls, fantastic fantasy novels. Getting back really quickly to Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling, I remember what I was going to mention earlier. We were talking about selling your soul. And, I'm not going to speculate about whether she actually did have this meeting with the devil where she signed a contract with her blood. But I would say it's my opinion that I truly do believe that there are people out there who interact and communicate directly with Satan. Just like in this world, there are people who going on the righteous side. There are people who act righteously. Maybe they aren't very religious. Maybe they aren't even Christian, but they have a good moral sense. And they're serving God and serving his interests, even unintentionally. Likewise, I believe that there are people out there who, a lot of these people who are part of this globalism, this great network, they're just evil, serving their own interests, doing other things. But I do believe that there's some of these actors who, like Cain of old, who talked face-to-face with Satan and made a deal with him. Mm-hmm. There's some of these people who are communicating face-to-face with Satan, receiving orders from him about what they need to do to erode Christianity in this world. And the last thing is a brief scripture that I would like to leave as a final thought before we depart. Because sometimes we can be disheartened with the great power these people influence, because sadly, these globalists with a lot of political, financial power, they're billionaires, they're heads of state, they're kings of the world. But in the second Psalm, we read these words. The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us. Now hear the words of hope. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall have them in derision. So the Lord, he looks upon all these potentates, these supposedly powerful individuals, but he laughs at them and holds them in derision, because all of their earthly power is nothing compared to his power, and by consequence, the power we can have so long as we serve him.
Amen. Definitely. It kind of reminds me of, the first shall be last and last shall be first. And, sometimes we can get too caught up in earthly perceptions. Like you said, a lot of these people are in power. They're the powerful ones. And we feel like we're the last, we're the low man on the totem pole. We're weak. We can't do anything. But I think that it really speaks to the power and the truth of Christianity and the gospel when we see that it is so enduring, even when it has had to retreat into caves and kind of, live there for hundreds of years and be passed on through generations, it has endured and survived and flourished because it is the truth, and it is ultimately the strongest thing that we have here on earth. And so we shouldn't be disheartened by earthly perceptions, because we're definitely on the stronger side there. So thank you for that. Thank you, Luis, for joining me today. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I would love to have you back sometime if you would be agreeable to that.
Of course, definitely would.
All right. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, everybody in the chat. Thank you especially to those super chats. We really appreciate them. It really helps keep things going around here and keep things running. And please always feel free to message me on social media if you have topic ideas or suggestions for shows that you'd like me to do, or guests that you would like to suggest. And I'd like to thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.